Hi guys, and welcome to another Coming from College podcast. Today's session is on critical reading and research skills. My name is Sophia, and I am going to be a fourth year psychology student.
And my name is Leo, and I'm going to be a third year theater and film student. We're just going to have a chat about critical reading and research skills. And we've prepared some questions about the topic that we think might help people coming to uni. We might not be able to answer everything in this session, but there is a live session on the same topic on the 17th of August, so you can pop along and find more support there. So Sophia, when you know roughly how to answer or like in which direction you want to go with answering a question for the essay or any assignment, what's your next step? Where do you start?
Well, I sort of go with having a search strategy because the next step is sort of looking into evidence that can back up what you're trying to answer and what argument you're making. So for whichever topic or whichever argument I'm trying to make, I identify like topics and I compile keywords for it. And then I organize them as well, just so I know which ones are most important. So I can start with searching those first. And then, yeah, I start reading through the sources that come up and I sort of evaluate them and whether or not I think they could be applicable. Again, there are so many options for where you could find these sources as well. There's like the Talus, there's subject specific databases and things, there's ResearchGate, and like EndNote Click as well. It gives you access to a lot of articles that you wouldn't really get before. But yeah, that's sort of where I start. What about you?
Well, usually I start searching the library catalog or just go to the library and like search the shelves.
Mm-hmm.
I usually think of what I read throughout the module or like in previous modules as well, so that I have somewhere like concrete to start.
Yeah.
Um, and then I go from there. I obviously expand it. If there's like a source in one of the literature that I read within the module, I would go and check that. And then, I slowly build on. And usually we've been like, we're told where roughly to look by a
Yeah.
lecture. So what types of sources do you use? Is it mostly online?
I mean, personally, I use mostly online sources, but that's because I can't access the library as much. But I sort of, yeah, tend to go for sort of scholarly professional resources because they are reliable and valid. You know, these can be books or articles, and they are often reviewed by the publication. And I think, like, yeah, scholarly articles are quite key when you're writing
Hmm.
anything because it does provide that critical analysis part. It is that bolstered evidence. And it sort of, yeah, aids your debate and your argument that you're making, and it can shape it quite effectively. You need valid sources to support the argument you're making, and have them say the right thing as well. But that, again, is a big task in itself if
Yeah.
you are making quite a specified argument. So it can take time,
Yeah.
like collecting all of these sources for sure.
Yeah. For me, at least, it takes the majority of the time for like an assignment.
Yeah.
I think I have a bit of a broader mix of sources
Mm-hmm.
because of what I study. Because apart from like academic writing, I also have to look at either films or plays, and I also look for some non-academic sources because sometimes industry magazines would have very good interviews that give you
Yeah.
like very specific insight from the creators.
Mm-hmm.
um
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a mix, right? You know,
yeah.
depending on the specific assignment for you. But yeah, because there have been a couple of times I've used non-academic things. So there are times people will have to use those.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's specified and sometimes it just sort of comes naturally with the course you're studying. I mean, for psychology is quite academic source based for the assignments, but there was one time I feel like reference I don't know if it was the Sunday Times or like the Sun article or something, which felt very wrong, but yeah, I had to use that as part of my assignment, which was required though. But yeah, so there are instances of that happening for sure.
So how many sources do you usually have, like per assignment or like per essay?
Good question. I feel like, again, there's never a golden rule, but
Oh,
sort of something that's a good gauge that I've used personally is around one source per 100 words. Again,
okay.
whatever type of source it is, if it non-academic or academic. But I use that mostly whilst planning as sort of like, yeah, a gauge of how my assignment's coming along and making sure I'm regularly using sources to back up my argument. So I'm not just rambling along. But yeah, and then whilst writing, again, it might change because when you are actually writing it, things do tend to change and not go according to your plan precisely. But around, yeah, 1/100 when planning, and then just whatever happens when you know, finish writing. What about you?
When I think of it back, I think it comes to roughly the same, yeah.
Yeah.
But sometimes it was also happened that we had like a minimum amount of sources that we have to use.
Yeah, I think in first year for sure there were like, you know, because it's hard to figure it out initially how many sources you should use, and then when you're writing shorter assignments. But yeah, a couple of times for sure. What like is it like when you have like 1,000 words? Is it around like 10 sources it's asking for as a minimum, or what's the amount for you normally?
See, we don't have it we don't have it that often, but I know that, for example, in first year for like the first assignments that we had, we had to use at least, I think, 2 sources from the critical reading that we did within the module.
Yeah.
And then I think for the very first assignment, we didn't have to use any other sources, but for later on, they said, you know, but if you want a good mark, you do need those other sources as well that you find on your own and you research on your own, because it shows like initiative, and it shows that you did the deeper dive and have a broader knowledge of the topic that you're writing about.
Yeah, definitely. But like, I mean, what if you're doing a topic though and you aren't finding enough material on it? How do you approach it then?
I mean, first I would think if that's really the way I want to go in, if I'm struggling that much.
So like the argument itself, whether it's the right argument. Yeah. Okay.
Because the thing is, if I'm going to struggle too much with finding sources, it's going to be a real pain to write something about it and not
100%.
just, you know, pull it out of thin air. But also, like, if I want to persist with it, I would go to the library staff. They're very helpful. And some lecturers would say that if we struggle a bit with finding sources, we can always come to them and they can point us in the right direction. They're not going to obviously say, oh, you know, use this specific book or something like that, but they will give you a broader reading and then tell you, but do something, like do more on your own as well.
Yeah, of course. It gives you that good starting spot as well if you are sort of unsure where to go if you're struggling with finding research. Yeah, I've contacted during first year as well, like a couple of lecturers as well for a bit of extra help because I was struggling with the topic too. So that's definitely an option.
I know, like some lecturers would say to us as well that before we start writing, we can always come and check with them if you know, if this is the right direction to go in, if it makes sense, the argument that we're making.
Yeah.
How do you narrow down your reading?
Good question. Because like honestly, if I'm looking at like 10 articles and they're all 20 pages each, I don't even know where to start. Like, but if I don't start, I can't really critically read anything or get a good argument set up. So you sort of have to pick out what sections you're going to read. And again, this does change depending what type of source you're looking at, whether it's like a research journal article or it's a chapter of a book or things like that. So for articles, I typically go with reading the abstract and then the conclusion and the summary at the end if there is one. That gives you quite an in-depth overview and you can see if there is anything that sort of suits what you're trying to say. And for books, they also quite often have summaries as well. And it gives you just, a quick idea of the scholarly source, and then you can figure out whether or not it suits.
So when you boil it down, how do you make sense of it? Like, how do you evaluate what you've read?
Well, I have to take it back to why I'm reading it, right? So I'm reading this for an assignment. I'm taking part in a debate. I'm trying to argue a certain point in regards to this subject. And I need to build upon that from ideas from other people and evaluate them and critiquing them. So to understand academic writing and research, I think you need sort of a general approach and strategy for it. So you need to sort of ask yourself, like, why am I reading this? What do I want to get out of it? What do I already know? And then how will I know when I've read enough? So, like, for that, again, as I said before, I tend to scan initially, so scanning the abstract, and if the abstract doesn't give me enough, I'll go into the first few pages or the last ones to see the summary, see if there's any keywords that stick out. If there is something that catches my eye, I then skim it to see a little more in depth. And if I find out that this is perfect and this is what would really be great, I read it in depth. I'm close reading, and that's reading it several times, reading it in detail, and making sure I understand what they're saying and the discussions of whatever topic it's about and how I can use it in my own argument. So, like, for that as well, just looking at specific research pieces, ask yourself, like, what is the research question and things, and then also, like, what's the critique, because you need to sort of get that critical approach. What's maybe an element that was let down, what's a bias of this research piece, or what's maybe something that's not supported in a theory or things like that. I mean, it's a big chunk to do, but sort of scanning, skimming, and close reading when you sort of settled on some articles or sources that you want to use. But yeah, what about you? Because I mean, this is just merely from a psychology-based view.
I mean, listening to you, I do a similar approach with like non-written sources. For example, if I have to write about a film, I would of course watch it in its entirety, because I would usually write about films that I've already seen. So I would rewatch it to make sure that it makes sense. And then as I watch it, I would either like write down what happens, or like what, not necessarily only what happens, but how it's shot, and different things, obviously, but stuff that I can use in the assignment. But it's basically a similar approach, whatever source you really use, I think, because you need to do that critical analysis of it, and you need to evaluate if it really makes sense to use it. No, how do you know when you've read enough, when you have enough material?
I sort of say stop is when, like, there's too much. And again, this is where sort of the gauge comes in for the amount of sources you're aiming to use. Because some things like might have small additions to your argument, but you have to evaluate them in comparison to the other ones. And then from that, you can choose, I'm going to use this set amount and for these bits of my argument. So that's where it comes through planning as well, because I don't know, for shorter essays, I stop like around after like having done research for a couple of days, right? And then having, I don't know how many articles I end up having, maybe like around 20, 25. And then I condense those down to the ones I think suit best according to my plan and how they integrate into that. But that's just my approach, because there are times I do get really caught up in it, and I've read like 100 articles on something super niche. So yeah, I'm not perfect at that at all. Like, do you have anything you sort of tend to go by to say now's done? Like, I'm not watching this movie anymore. I'm not reading this again, or whatever.
I mean, I think I stop when I think I have enough sources to support my arguments, so that they make sense in a way that there's also a red thread throughout the essay.
Yeah, and it's almost like a story.
Exactly, yeah. And because I usually take notes in like a notebook, I would sort of do structure then already, and like have like I sometimes copy like quotes from sources, or like, and then on the sides I would write my arguments, like, oh, I'm going to use this to support something. And because I really need the structure of the thing before I write it, that's when I also start to structure it.
Yeah, that sounds good. Definitely. I think like having an overview of your sources before planning is also a good idea. If that, like, that can be a great idea as well, because like, that is essentially what you're building your essay around. So knowing what there is available already before
Yeah.
you sort of start planning it out properly is a great approach. Yeah, no, for sure. But like in that sort of like the same vein, like when do you reference, like do you reference during your planning or when you're reading through it, or do you reference at the end when you've actually like have the whole assignment written up?
See, I always try to do it as I do the reading, as I'm researching, because not I don't always manage to do it to do the proper formatting, like the proper referencing. Sometimes I if I have enough time, I do it just so that I'm done with it and that I have the feeling of, you know, oh, I did something already, and then it's easier to continue. But if I'm in a bit of a, you know, time rush, I would usually just, when I'm taking notes, I do the author and the title, or like author and year, just so that I know where to. And usually I save, if I have online resources, I would have a file and just save those links so that I like I can find it always. Because it happened with some assignments that I was like, I know that I read this somewhere, but I don't know where, and I wasted a whole lot of time finding it again because I needed it for the argument that I was making.
Yeah, because there have been many times I remember reading this somewhere and it is the best, it'll save my essay and you just don't know where it is.
Yes.
And save yourself, please don't do what we've done. Like there's regrets. So yeah, during planning, and even if you feel extra organized during reading, start like during the semester as well. But when you're reading and planning your essay, start there, sourcing there. But I mean, yeah, no one's perfect, so can't do that every time because there's a bit of a time crunch here and there for some assignments.
Yeah, no, I agree. Like it definitely happened for me as well.
Yeah. I think it happens to a student at least once in their uni career. It's just a natural part of life, I guess.
If it's only once, that person is lucky.
I know. Yeah, I was about to say it's not just happened once for me over the past 3 years, but again, you live and you learn. But again, really rooting and creating such a solid like reading compilation and your plan will make writing and referencing. I mean, referencing is done then, you know, so writing is a breeze. I think that sort of encapsulates us for this session and sort of how we would approach the various aspects to critical reading and research. Thanks very much for listening. We hope it's been nice and good.
Yeah, thank you for listening.